Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Episode 11. I have paid a visit to the Heights, but have not seen Cathy since she left. I had a long talk with Zillah about 6 weeks ago, and she told me that on her arrival at the Heights, Cathy shut herself into Linton's room and remained there till morning. Then, while the master and Earnshaw were at breakfast, she entered the house and asked if the doctor might be sent for because her cousin was very ill.
"We know that," answered Heathcliff, "but his life is not worth a farthing, and I won't spend a farthing on him."
"But if nobody will help me, he'll die," said Cathy.
"Let me never hear a word more about him," cried the master. "None here care what becomes of him. If you do, act the nurse. If you do not, lock him up and leave him."
One night she went to Zillah's chamber and said, "Tell Mr. Heathcliff that his son is dying. I'm sure he is this time. Get up instantly and tell him." Catherine's message was delivered. Heathcliff cursed and proceeded to their room. Mrs. Heathcliff was seated by the bedside. Her father-in-law went up, held the light to Linton's face, looked at him and touched him. Afterwards he turned to her.
"Now, Catherine," he said, "how do you feel?"
"He's safe and I'm free," she answered. In the morning, Cathy was ill and stayed upstairs a fortnight. Heathcliff went up once to show her Linton's will. He had bequeathed the whole of his and what had been her movable property to his father. The poor creature was threatened into that act during her week's absence when his uncle died. Furthermore, Heathcliff claimed and kept Thrushcross Grange in his wife's right, and in his own right also. Legally, Cathy is now destitute of cash and friends, and cannot disturb his possession. Zillah said that nobody ever approached her door but she, and nobody asked anything about her. The first occasion of her coming down into the house was on a Sunday afternoon when the master was going to Thrushcross Grange and Joseph had gone to church. Hareton was informed that his cousin would very likely come down to sit with them. He coloured up at the news and cast his eye over his hands and clothes, for he meant to give her his company and he wanted to be presentable. Zillah offered to help him, and he allowed her to do so, and when Catherine came, half forgetting her former insults, he tried to make himself agreeable. She walked in as proud as a princess, and Zillah got up to offer her seat. Earnshaw rose too, and bid her come to the settle and sit close by the fire, as he was sure she was starved. "I've been starved a month and more," she answered, and she got a chair for herself and placed it at a distance from both of them. Having sat till she was warm, she began to look around and discovered a number of books on the dresser. She tried to reach them, but they were too high up. Her cousin summoned courage to help her. She didn't thank him, but he was gratified that she had accepted his assistance, and ventured to stand behind as she examined them, and even to stoop and point out what struck his fancy in the pictures. She continued reading. His attention became, by degrees, quite centred in her thick, silky curls, and attracted like a child to a candle, he put out his hand and stroked it as gently as if it were a bird. She turned as if he had struck a knife into her neck. "Get away this moment! How dare you touch me?" she cried. "I'll go upstairs again if you come near me."
"Oh, Mr. Hareton wishes you would read to us, ma'am,"
Zillah said immediately. She frowned, and looking up, answered, "Mr. Hareton and the whole set of you will be good enough to understand that I reject any pretence at kindness you offer. I despise you, and will have nothing to say to any of you. When I would have given my life for one kind word, you all kept away. I'm driven here by the cold, not either to amuse you or to enjoy your society."
"What could I have done?" began Earnshaw. "How was I to blame? More than once I asked Mr. Heathcliff to let me watch Linton for you."
"Be silent. I'll go anywhere rather than have your disagreeable voice in my ear," said my lady. Hareton muttered that she might go to hell. "She now has no friend among them, and," said Zillah, "she does not deserve one, for if anyone says the least word to her, she'll snap back. She'll even snap at the master himself and dares him to thrash her, and the more hurt she gets, the more venomous she grows." Thus ended Mrs. Dean's story. I rapidly recovered my strength, but decided I would not pass another winter here. I rode over to Wuthering Heights to inform the landlord that I would spend the next 6 months in London, and if he likes, he may look out for another tenant to take the place after October. Mrs. Dean had entreated me to bear a little note from her to her young lady, and when I arrived, Earnshaw was in the garden, and I asked if Mr. Heathcliff were at home. He answered no, but said he would return at dinner time. We entered together. Catherine was there, and looked sulkier and less spirited than when I had seen her before. She hardly raised her eyes to notice me, and did not return my good morning. She does not seem so amiable, I thought, as Mrs. Dean would persuade me to believe. She's a beauty, it is true, but not an angel. I approached her and dropped Mrs. Dean's note onto her knee, unnoticed by Hareton, but she asked aloud, "What is that?" and chucked it off. "A letter from the housekeeper at the Grange," I answered, annoyed at her exposing my kind deed. She would gladly have gathered it up at this information, but Hareton beat her to it and put it in his waistcoat, saying Mr. Heathcliff should look at it first. Catherine turned her face from us, quietly weeping, and her cousin, after struggling a while to keep down his sober feelings, pulled out the letter and flung it on the floor beside her. Catherine read it eagerly. "You must tell Ellen," she said, "that I would answer her letter, but I have no materials for writing, not even a book from which I might tear a leaf." "No books?" I exclaimed. "How do you contrive to live here without them?" "I was always reading when I had them," said Catherine. "Mr. Heathcliff never reads, so he destroyed my books. I have not had a glimpse of one for weeks, except once. Hareton, I came upon a secret stock in your room, all old friends, and I brought them here, and you gathered them for the mere love of stealing. They are of no use to you. You concealed them, thinking that, as you cannot enjoy them, nobody else shall." Earnshaw blushed crimson and stammered an indignant denial of her accusations. "Mr. Hareton is desirous of increasing his amount of knowledge," I said, coming to his rescue. "He'll be a clever scholar in a few years." "Yes, I hear him trying to spell and read to himself. Oh, and what a mess he makes of it." "But, Mrs. Heathcliff, we have each had to begin." "Oh," she replied, "I don't wish to limit his acquirements. Still, he has no right to take what is mine and make it ridiculous to me with his vile mistakes and mispronunciations." Hareton left the room, but presently reappeared, bearing 6 volumes in his hands, which he threw into Catherine's lap, exclaiming, "Take them! I never want to hear or read or think of them again." "I won't have them now," she answered. "I shall connect them with you and hate them." She opened one and read a portion in the slow tone of a beginner, and then laughed and threw it from her. But Hareton would endure no further torment. He gathered the books and hurled them onto the fire. I read in his countenance what anguish it was to offer that sacrifice to spleen. I fancied I guessed the incitement to his secret studies. He had been content with daily labour and rough enjoyments until Catherine crossed his path. Shame at her scorn and hope of her approval were his prompters to learning, and his endeavours to raise himself had produced more scorn. "Yes, That's all the good that such a brute as you can get from them, cried Catherine.
You'd better hold your tongue now,
he answered fiercely, and hurried from the room, passing Mr. Heathcliff in the doorway. My business with my landlord was very soon finished. How dreary life gets in that house, I reflected while riding down the road. What a fairy tale it would have been for Mrs. Linton Heathcliff had she and I struck up an attachment and gone off together into the stirring atmosphere of the town. This September I was invited to visit a friend in the north, and on my journey to his abode I unexpectedly came within 15 miles of Gimmerton. A sudden impulse seized me to visit Thrushcross Grange. I thought that I might as well pass the night under my own roof as in an inn. I reached the Grange before sunset, and at the kitchen door found an old woman sitting on the steps. "Is Mrs. Dean within?" I demanded. "Mrs. Dean? Nay," she answered. "She don't live here. She's up at Heights." "Well, I'm Mr. Lockwood, the master. I wish to stay here all night." "Master?" she cried in astonishment. "Why, should have sent word." I bid her be calm and prepare a bedroom for me to sleep in, and meantime I would go out for a walk to Wuthering Heights. "Is all well at the Heights?" I inquired. "Yep, for all I know," she answered, hurrying away. I would have asked why Mrs. Dean had deserted the Grange, but it was impossible to delay her at such a time. On reaching Mr. Heathcliff's dwelling, I found the garden gate open. Both doors and windows were open too, and not far from one of the windows yet, as is usually the case in a coal district, a fine red fire illumined the chimney. The comfort which the eye derives from, I could see and hear two people talking before I entered. "Contrary," said a voice as sweet as a silver bell, "I'm not going to tell you again. Recollect, or I'll pull your hair." "Contrary, then," answered another, in deep but softened tones. "And now kiss me for minding so well." "No, read it over first correctly, without a single mistake." The male speaker began to read. He was a young man, respectably dressed, and seated at a table, having a book before him. His handsome features glowed with pleasure, and his eyes kept impatiently wandering from the page to a small white hand over his shoulder. Its owner stood behind. It was lucky he could not see her face, or he would never have been so steady. The task was done, not free from further blunders, but the pupil claimed a reward and received at least 5 kisses, which he generously returned. They came to the door, and I judged they were about to issue out and have a walk on the moors. Unseen, I hurried to the kitchen. At the door sat my old friend Nellie Dean, sewing. She jumped to her feet, crying, "Why, bless you, Mr. Lockwood, how could you think of returning in this way? All shut up at Thrushcross Grange. You should have given us notice." "I've arranged to be accommodated there," I answered. "I depart again tomorrow." "And how are you transplanted here, Mrs. Dean? Tell me that." "Oh, Zillah left, and Mr. Heathcliff wished me to come soon after you went to London, and stay till you returned. But step in, pray. Have you walked from Gimmerton?" "From the Grange," I replied. "I want to finish my business with your master, because I don't think of having another opportunity in a hurry." "What business, sir?" said Nellie. "He's got out at present." "About the rent," I answered. "Oh, then it was Mrs. Heathcliff you must settle," she observed, "or rather with me. She has not learnt to manage her affairs yet, and I act for her." I looked surprised. "Ah, you have not heard of Heathcliff's death, I see," she continued. "Heathcliff? Dead?" I exclaimed, astonished. "How long ago?" 3 months. But sit down, and I'll tell you all about it." And so she sat back and told me the end of Heathcliff's history. I was summoned to Wuthering Heights within a fortnight of your leaving us, and I obeyed joyfully for Catherine's sake. Mr. Heathcliff said he was tired of seeing her. He said I must take the little parlour for my sitting room and keep her with me. It was enough if he were obliged to see her at meals. She seemed pleased at this arrangement, and I brought over a great number of books from the Grange. Catherine, contented at first, in a brief space grew irritable and restless. For one thing, she was forbidden to move out of the garden. For another, in running the house, I was forced to quit her frequently, and she complained of loneliness. She preferred quarrelling with Joseph in the kitchen to sitting at peace in her solitude, and Hareton was often obliged to be in the kitchen also. In the beginning, she neither noticed nor addressed him, commenting on his stupidity and idleness, expressing her wonder how he could endure the life he lived, how he could sit a whole evening staring into the fire and dozing. "He's just like a dog, is he not, Ellen?" she once observed, "or a cart horse. He does his work, eats his food, and sleeps. What a blank, dreary mind he must have." "I know why Hareton never speaks when I am in the kitchen," she explained on another occasion. "He is afraid I shall laugh at him, Ellen. What do you think? He began to teach himself to read once, and because I laughed, he burned his books and dropped it. Was he not a fool?" "Were you not naughty?" I said. "Answer me that." "Perhaps I was," she went on. "Hareton, if I gave you a book, would you take it now? I'll try." She placed one in his hand. He flung it off and muttered he would break her neck. "Well, I shall put it here," she said, "and I'm going to bed." But he would not come near it, and I saw she was sorry for frightening him off improving himself. But her ingenuity was at work to remedy the injury. She would bring some pleasant volume and read it aloud to me. When Hareton was there, she generally paused in an interesting part and left the book lying about. But he was obstinate and did his best to disregard it. Mr. Heathcliff, who grew more and more disinclined to society, had almost banished Earnshaw from his apartment. Then, one day, Hareton cut his arm, and he lost a good deal of blood, so that he was condemned to the fireside in the kitchen for a few days. On the Easter Monday, Joseph went to Gimmerstone Fair with some cattle, and in the afternoon I was busy in the kitchen. Earnshaw sat morose as usual at the chimney corner, and my little mistress was drawing pictures, but presently I heard her begin. "I found out, Hareton, that I'm glad, that I should like you to be my cousin now, if you had not grown so cross to me and so rough." Hareton returned no answer. Hareton, do you hear?"
"Get off with you," he growled.
"Stop," she cried. "You must listen to me."
"Will you go to devil?" he exclaimed ferociously. "And let me be."
"No," she persisted, "I won't. I can't tell you what to do to make you talk to me, and you are determined not to understand. When I call you stupid, I don't mean that I despise you. Come, Hareton, you are my cousin, and you shall own me."
"I shall have naught to do with you and your pride and your damned tricks," he answered. "I'll go to hell, body and soul, before I look at you again. Get out my way this minute."
"You should be friends with your cousin, Mr. Hareton," I interrupted, "since she repents of her sauciness. It would do you a great deal of good to have her for a companion."
"A companion?" he cried, "when she hates me and doesn't think me fit to wipe her shoes."
"It is not I who hate you. It is you who hate me," wept Cathy. "You hate me as much as Mr. Heathcliff does."
"You're a damned liar," began Earnshaw. Why have I made him angry by taking your part, then 100 times, and that when you sneered at and despised me?"
"I didn't know you took my part," she answered, drying her eyes, "and I was miserable and bitter at everybody, but now I thank you and beg you to forgive me." She extended her hand. He blackened and kept his fists resolutely clenched and his gaze fixed on the ground. Catherine, by instinct, must have divined it was obstinacy and not dislike, and impressed on his cheeks a gentle kiss. I shook my head, and then she blushed and whispered, "Well, what should I have done, Ellen? He wouldn't shake hands, and he wouldn't look. I must show him in some way that I like him, that I want to be friends." Whether the kiss convinced him, I cannot tell. He was very careful for some minutes that his face should not be seen, and when he did raise it, he was sadly puzzled where to turn his eye. Catherine employed herself in wrapping a handsome book neatly in white paper, and having addressed it to Mr. Hareton Earnshaw, she desired me to convey the present to her cousin. "And tell him, if he'll take it, I'll come and teach him to read it right," she said. "And if he refuses it, I'll go upstairs and never tease him again." I carried it and repeated the message anxiously watched by my employer. Hareton would not open his fingers, so I laid it on his knee. He did not strike it off, so I returned to my work. Catherine leaned her head on the table till she heard the slight rustle of the covering being removed, and then she quietly seated herself beside her cousin. He trembled, and his face glowed. All his rudeness had deserted him. "Say you forgive me, Hareton. Do." He muttered something. "And you'll be my friend?" added Catherine. "Nay, you'll be ashamed of me every day of your life," he answered, "and I can't bear that." "So you won't be my friend?" she said, smiling, as sweet as honey, and creeping close up. On looking round, I perceived 2 such radiant countenances bent over the page of the accepted book that I did not doubt the enemies were thenceforth sworn allies. The intimacy thus commenced grew rapidly. Earnshaw was not to be civilized with a wish, and my young lady was no paragon of patience, but both their minds tending to the same point, they contrived, in the end, to reach it.